So I wasn't really planning on doing another video until later this month, but Soul dropped on Disney Plus on Christmas, and like most people who have been in quarantine since March, we spent the holiday eating pizza and watching television.
Well, happy birthday, Jesus. Sorry your party's so lame.
And while I enjoyed the film overall, a few aspects of it kept nagging at me over this past week, until eventually I decided to bite the bullet and lay a few of my thoughts down here. And if this does seem a little more off the cuff than the usual content on the channel, that's because it totally is. But I thought this might be a fun way where I can express a few of my thoughts and maybe inspire some new reviews in the future. And this might seem a little obvious, but if you haven't seen the film yet, I do recommend pausing the video and going to watch it, because there will be heavy spoilers from here on out. But who am I kidding? It's Pixar, you've already seen it, let's get into this. Soul is Disney's latest attempt in their quest for total global domination, and comes from the minds of Kemp Powers and Pixar staple Pete Docter, who brought us such films as Up and the spiritually similar Inside Out. Soul explores the concepts of life, death, and the great beyond through the eyes of Joe Gardner, a middle school band teacher in New York. And first things first, this film looks fantastic. The Earth-based scenes are some of the most realistic and layered work that Pixar has ever done. I know The Good Dinosaur's only real takeaway was its imagery, and seeing that same photorealism applied to a contemporary urban setting is really mind-blowing at times. Even on a television screen, the colors, the characters, and the landscapes just pop. This is probably Pixar's best use of lighting to date. For the scenes that take place in The Great Before, The Great After, I was initially worried that it would feel like a lesser Inside Out, and story-wise it sometimes does. But the design of it is both unique and much more abstract than anything Pixar has attempted before, making the land almost feel like a cosmic World's Fair of sorts. If anything, it skews towards 60s surrealism and the likes of Yellow Submarine than any of their previous films. And I appreciate the diversity in the character designs as well. All the human characters felt natural, even if they were slightly stylized. I mean, we've come a long way from Tin Toy's Demon Baby. The unborn souls of The Great Before, though, did feel a little too generic for me. I get they have to exhibit their blank slate disposition, but they teetered into Illumination's sidekick territory at times, almost to the likes of like the Lorax or even Minions. The Watchers on the other side, or Jerrys as they refer to themselves, were really unique and creative, almost appearing as 2D hand-drawn animation at times. I know it's relatively minor, but I interpreted their design to have an almost intentional gender fluidity to it by exhibiting a mix of both male and female traits, even if their voice acting did imply one over the other. Though, in one of the movie's stronger jokes, they did explain each soul's voice was merely a preference of that soul, which is why the unborn 22 sounds like a middle-aged Tina Fey. Which leads me to another positive with the voice cast. Jamie Foxx does a very impressive job of blending into the role of a middle-aged, downtrodden band teacher. He gives Joe heart and humor and a personality, especially since he ends up having to play outside of Joe's body for the majority of the film. Even when Joe is forced to be a cat, more on that in a bit, Jamie's at least able to give Joe enough of his same mannerisms that you still get a sense of who Joe is as a person. Serving as his comedic foil is Tina Fey, who does most of the comedic heavy lifting for the film. And she delivers it fine, and I fully understand why they wanted to cast a known comedic actor in the role, but I just wish they gave her better material to work with. Which, the humor on the whole, didn't really work for me. It just felt a little forced and even dated at times. I mean, they throw in a pizza rat joke. Though they did have a solid Nick burn in there, which did catch me off guard. With additional vocal performances by Felicia Rashad, Richard Ayoade, and even Questlove, Pixar brings their usual high level of talent. It's just a shame that most of them barely get more than a scene or two. I mean, they get David freaking Diggs and barely give him 4 lines of dialogue. Now, the script has a surprising amount of maturity and frankness that I think has yet to be seen on this level from the studio. And I don't mean mature as in they just throw in some curses and cheap sex jokes to keep the parents on board, but actual maturity. They don't shy away from the harsh realities of life, death, depression, and even spirituality. It was kinda like they looked at Coco and Zootopia and said, "Hold my beer." Not that Pixar's ever shied away from intense or mature subject matter. I feel like the difference here, though, is that we haven't delved into the existential side of these issues before. And honestly, I think this movie has more in common with Coco than Inside Out, which is where it falters. Now, this may be a bad take, but to me, it seems that both of these films were made in reverse. And by that I mean that both had an ending statement in mind and built their stories backwards from that final moral. For Coco, it was following one's dream and that those we love will never be gone as long as we remember their stories in spirit. Now Soul, on the other hand, hangs everything on living life to the fullest and slowing down to appreciate the little moments, which is a great message to have, especially when aimed towards a younger audience. It's one you don't hear that often as a child. Joe spends most of the film pursuing his dream of becoming a professional jazz musician, and when he finally gets his big break, it doesn't hit the way he expects it to. And that's also a great message to showcase in a children's film. Pixar usually is really good about showing how our dreams and expectations may change, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. The problem here is that Joe's revelation ends up coming off as a lesser story beat to 22's. 22's will to live is the film's emotional climax, and Joe's merely leads up to it. And I think that's where the film becomes confused, with the messages of wanting to live and experience life and living life to the fullest are tangential but ultimately different. And the movie's focus ends up falling somewhere in between. I'm also torn that we never see any inclination to how Joe's life turns out. I understand that part of it is poetic in the sense that it doesn't really matter since his changed perspective is what's important, but it still would have been nice to see some nods to his future. I think showing that his true purpose was to be a mentor and not a musician could help bring his journey full circle and help wrap up a few loose storylines. I mean, I expected Connie, the trombone student of his, to have more of a role, but when she serves her purpose in inspiring 22, they kick her out of the film. In fact, it seems all the side characters are there to just serve a certain plot point and then get out of the way for more 22 antics. The one exception might be Graham Norton's hippie Bing Bong character, though he just kind of felt like a human art from Monsters University. Even Joe has to take a back seat though during the second act. Sure, we still see things from Joe's perspective, and his motivation to not die prematurely does keep the plot rolling, but once 22 enters the picture, it's her show. Which is disappointing because the film's emotional highlights center around Joe's story. His reconciliation with his mother, the relationship he had with his father, and music, and frankly, these are the most interesting parts of the film. 22's journey from reluctance to acceptance of life just isn't that compelling, especially since the story's been done before. The version I remember was called Delivering Milo and came out in 2001. In it, a guardian angel takes a reluctant unborn child to experience life on Earth to convince him to be born. And the only reason I even know that this film exists is I saw it on an airplane as a child on a trip to Disney World. I honestly have no memory if the film's even good. According to Rotten Tomatoes, it's not, but it does exist. I will say, I was really concerned that the film would end with Joe sacrificing his time on Earth for 22's, and I'm glad they gave us a Deus Ex Jerry to let Joe live. Now, the subject of race and representation has surrounded this film since it was first announced, and as a younger male of the Caucasian persuasion, I'm not gonna pretend that I have any authority to comment on if Soul succeeds in its representation. This is not my story, and my opinion is not one that matters here. I will say that the trend of colored animated characters being transformed into non-human entities has garnered widespread criticism. And this film barely lets Joe be himself for 10 minutes before he becomes a Happy Meal toy. And even when we are reunited with his human form, Tina Fey's the one driving, as Joe's stuck in the aforementioned cat. In fact, she ends up spending more time in Joe's body in the film than he does. It seems the film has sparked an interesting discourse on the matter, and I am really curious to see what Soul's legacy is in the future. As for now though, I'll let the experts do the talking. What also doesn't help Soul, though, is that its pacing seems to be off, with the majority of the second act spent on typical fish-out-of-water antics and chase scenes. I did appreciate the lack of an antagonist, though, as I can't really consider Terry, the departing Soul's accountant, as a villain, and the climax is spent battling 22's depression monster almost in the same way that Inside Out is spent battling Riley's. Frankly, I wish Disney would push more towards films that showed that sometimes life doesn't have a mustache-twirling villain, but rather self-made obstacles that we have to overcome. It's certainly more engaging than their recent surprise villain of the month trope. When it comes down to it, Soul loses some of its impact due to the story and characters crumpling under the weight of its themes. After stripping away the spiritual angle, it kinda becomes a typical Freaky Friday plot where two opposing characters learn self-truths since they were forced to change their perspectives. And maybe you can chalk the simplicity up to wanting to keep the story easy to follow for the children in the audience, but honestly, I wouldn't take anyone under the age of 7 to this film. Probably closer to 10. There's nothing really frightening or inappropriate about it. I mean, Zootopia and Frozen feature way more peril, but the themes are so high concept and conveyed primarily through dialogue, it would be very easy for a young child to tune out or become confused. Now, the music throughout this film is fantastic, especially its use and celebration of jazz. I never thought I would live to see the day where a Pixar film could stand on its own without Michael Giacchino's help, but damn does Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross, and Jon Batiste really nail it here. Which leads us to the emotional impact of the film. And maybe it's its use of song, but Coco's emotional weight just hit me more than Soul's. I mean, I full-on ugly cried in the theater for the final 10 minutes of the film the first time I saw it, but with Soul it just felt a little too ineffable to really emotionally connect. But in keeping with the film's theme of jazz and how it's the personal music expression of oneself, maybe this film is focused on a more subtle and evolving connection, rather than a full frontal emotional assault. It did lead me here after all. All in all, Soul is a beautiful looking film that touches on some very important themes in a unique and meaningful way. I wish I could express it better, but there are moments in this film that just don't feel like Pixar. It feels new and different, and that's really exciting. I mean, they're still just moments, but my biggest hope is that this film will serve as a stepping stone for a new way of storytelling for the studio. The only time I felt this way before about their films was with The Good Dinosaur, and that wasn't in a positive way. With Soul, it feels like Pixar has grown with this audience and can speak to us now like adults. And don't get me wrong, I would take an experimental piece like this one over Toy Story 4 or Finding Dory any day. And I hope my thoughts don't come across as too negative, as I did enjoy the film. I just feel like there were a few too many missed opportunities for it to reach its lofty ambitions. I am certainly curious what impact this film will have going forward, both for the film itself and Disney's streaming conquest overall. Also, can we please keep Soul out of the Disney parks? Just the thought of changing the sailing ship Columbia to be Moonwind's Friendship, or have 22's Soul Dance Party in Tomorrowland, really cheapens the film's message for me. I think the only way you could make it work in the parks is by establishing an actual jazz club in downtown Disney or Disney Springs that would have jazz musicians performing nightly, when you could throw in a couple references to the film in like pictures or by name only. Now, whatever the case may be, it seems that 2020 has certainly changed the way we digest entertainment. But going off of Soul's message, change isn't always for the worse, and even in a year as crappy as this one, it's still possible to find a few ways to enjoy life's smaller moments. So that basically leaves me with, what did you think of Soul? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Do you think my takes are accurate? Do you think I completely missed the mark? And would you be interested in seeing any further reviews on this channel? I'm kinda debating doing Wonder Woman 84 if there's time, but I honestly can't promise I'll be as kind as I was in this one. In any case though, have a happy and safe New Year's everyone, and I'll see you in the coming weeks with a brand new video essay and the premiere of our new series, What's the Score?